You wake up one morning and the world is silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from snow muffling sound, or the quiet of a neighborhood still asleep. This is different. This is the silence of something missing. You look outside and everything appears normal. Trees are still there. The sky is still blue. The roads curve the way they always have. But something fundamental has changed, and you can't quite name it. You check your phone. Nothing. You turn on the television. Static. You step outside and the air feels different on your skin, not colder or warmer, just different in a way that makes your chest tighten. You walk down the street and you see other people emerging from their homes, looking around with the same confused expression you're wearing. Everyone is searching for something they can't identify. And then, slowly, the realization begins to dawn. The power grids are down. The internet is gone. Every satellite has stopped transmitting. Every computer has reset to zero. Every piece of digital infrastructure that humanity spent decades building has simply vanished, as if it never existed. But that's not the strange part. The strange part is that no one can remember how any of it worked. Not the engineers, not the programmers, not the scientists. The knowledge is just gone, deleted from every mind that once held it. And in that moment, standing in the middle of a street that suddenly feels ancient and unfamiliar, you understand that something has happened that shouldn't be possible. Human civilization has been reset. Not destroyed. Not ended. Just brought back to a state that humanity hasn't experienced in generations. And the question that begins to form in your mind, the question that will haunt you for days and months and years to come, is this: what if this has happened before? Pause for a moment. Let that question settle into you. And before we go deeper, tell me something. Where are you watching this video from? And what time is it right now? Drop your country and the exact hour in the comments. If the world really reset, this might be the last digital trace of you being here. Because what we're about to explore isn't just a thought experiment about technology failing. It's not a story about apocalypse or disaster. It's something stranger and more unsettling than that. It's a journey into a possibility that sits at the edge of what we know about human history, about memory, about the very nature of civilization itself. And the deeper we go, the more you'll realize that the ground you're standing on, the reality you think is solid and continuous, might be more fragile than you ever imagined. There's a strange comfort in believing that human progress moves in one direction. Forward. Always forward. We tell ourselves a story about civilization that goes like this. Humans lived in caves, then we discovered fire, then agriculture, then writing, then cities, then industry, then technology. And now here we are, standing at the peak of everything we've ever accomplished. The story is linear, simple, makes sense. And like most simple stories, it might be wrong. Because when you actually look at human history, when you really examine the archaeological record and the gaps in our knowledge and the strange anomalies that don't fit the neat narrative, you start to see cracks. You start to see moments where something happened that we can't fully explain. You start to see evidence that maybe, just maybe, the path of human civilization hasn't been a straight line climbing upward. Maybe it's been a cycle, rising and falling, building and collapsing, remembering and forgetting. The ancient Greeks had a word for this. They called it ekpyrosis, the cosmic cycle, the eternal return. The idea that the universe itself moves through phases of creation and destruction, that everything that has happened will happen again. That time is not a line but a circle. They weren't alone in this belief. Ancient Hindu texts speak of the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness that follows ages of enlightenment. The Maya had their long count calendar, marking vast cycles of time that stretched across thousands of years. Cultures separated by oceans and continents with no contact between them all arrived at the same strange conclusion: that human civilization rises and falls in patterns, in rhythms, in cycles that repeat across spans of time so vast that we forget they ever happened. We dismissed these ideas as mythology, as primitive attempts to make sense of a chaotic world. We told ourselves that we know better now, that we have science and archaeology and carbon dating and all the tools we need to understand our past. But what if those ancient cultures were trying to tell us something true? What if they were preserving a memory of something real, something that happened so long ago that it became legend, and then myth, and then was forgotten entirely? Think about what we actually know about human history. Go back 10,000 years. That's not very far in geological terms. It's barely a blink. And yet, everything before that point becomes fuzzy, uncertain. We have artifacts, yes. We have cave paintings and stone tools and burial sites. But we don't have the full story. We have fragments, pieces of a puzzle that doesn't quite fit together. And the further back you go, the stranger those pieces become. There are structures on this planet that shouldn't exist. Not according to the timeline we've constructed for human civilization. In Turkey, there's a place called Göbekli Tepe. It's a complex of massive stone pillars, arranged in circles, carved with intricate designs of animals and symbols. It was built approximately 11,000 years ago. Think about that date. 11,000 years ago, according to the standard narrative, humans were supposed to be nomadic hunter-gatherers. Small tribes wandering the landscape, barely surviving, nowhere near capable of organizing the kind of labor force needed to quarry and transport and erect stones weighing multiple tons. And yet there it is, Göbekli Tepe, older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years, older than the pyramids of Egypt by 7,000 years. Just sitting there in the ground, challenging everything we thought we knew about when civilization began. And it's not alone. There are similar anomalies scattered across the planet. Underwater structures off the coast of Japan, geometric formations that look too precise to be natural. Stone walls in Peru fitted together with such precision that you can't slide a piece of paper between the blocks, built without mortar, without modern tools, without any technology that we can identify. Ancient maps that show the coastline of Antarctica as it appeared before it was covered in ice, which shouldn't be possible because Antarctica has been frozen for millions of years. And yet the maps exist, copied and recopied from even older sources that have been lost to time. You start to get the feeling that something is missing from our history. Something big. Not just a few details or dates or names, but entire chapters. Entire civilizations, perhaps. Entire rises and falls of human achievement that got buried under ice or water or sand or time itself. And the more you look, the more you realize that the evidence isn't just in ancient structures or mysterious artifacts. It's in our own biology, in our own minds. There's something strange about human consciousness that we don't talk about enough. We have this capacity for language, for abstract thought, for building complex tools and passing knowledge from one generation to the next. But when did that capacity emerge? The standard answer is that it evolved gradually over hundreds of thousands of years, that small mutations and environmental pressures slowly shaped our brains into what they are today. But here's the thing. Anatomically, modern humans have existed for at least 200,000 years, maybe longer. We had the same brain size, the same physical capabilities, the same potential for thought and creativity that we have now. And for the vast majority of that time, approximately 190,000 years, we didn't build cities or invent writing or create art or do any of the things that we associate with civilization. We just existed, survived, and then, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, something changed. Suddenly, in a span of time that's incredibly brief by evolutionary standards, humans all over the world started settling down, domesticating plants and animals, building permanent structures, developing languages and systems of organization. Happened too fast, too suddenly, almost as if someone flipped a switch, or as if we were remembering something we had forgotten. There's a concept in psychology called cryptomnesia. It's when you think you're creating something new, but you're actually remembering something you experienced before and forgot. The memory is still there, buried in your subconscious, and it emerges disguised as original thought. What if civilization works the same way? What if the sudden burst of human innovation 10,000 years ago wasn't the first time we built civilizations? What if it was the most recent time we rebuilt them? Consider how fragile our current civilization actually is. Right now, at this moment, nearly everything that keeps modern society functioning exists in digital form. The internet, banking systems, power grids, communication networks, medical records, government databases. All of it is stored on servers and hard drives and in the cloud, which isn't actually a cloud but just more servers in warehouses scattered around the world. And all of that digital infrastructure is vulnerable, not just to hackers or wars or natural disasters, but to something much simpler and much more terrifying: forgetting. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine that tomorrow, every person on Earth with specialized technical knowledge suddenly disappeared. No scientists, no engineers, no programmers, just gone. How long do you think the rest of us could keep things running? The power plants would shut down within days, because no one would know how to maintain them. The water treatment facilities would fail. The supply chains would collapse. Within weeks, maybe months, we'd be back to a pre-industrial state of existence. And within a generation or two, the knowledge of how any of that technology worked would be completely lost. The children growing up in that world would look at the ruins of skyscrapers and factories the same way we look at ancient megaliths. With wonder, with confusion, with no real understanding of how they were made or what they were for. Now extend that thought experiment. Imagine that instead of people disappearing, the knowledge itself disappeared. Some event, some catastrophe, some phenomenon we don't understand, that wiped out not the population but the memory. Left everyone alive but reset their understanding back to zero. No one remembers how to read. No one remembers mathematics. No one remembers the scientific method or engineering principles or any of the accumulated wisdom that took centuries to develop. What would be left? Stories, maybe. Myths about the time before, passed down orally, changing with each retelling, becoming more symbolic and less literal until they're no longer recognizable as history. And artifacts, structures and objects that survive the reset, lying dormant in the landscape, waiting to be rediscovered by the descendants of the people who forgot how to make them. Does this sound familiar? 'Cause it should. Sounds exactly like the world we live in now. A world filled with ancient monuments we can't quite explain, built using techniques we can't quite replicate, by people we assume were primitive but who somehow managed to accomplish engineering feats that challenge our modern capabilities. A world where every culture has flood myths and stories of ancient catastrophes and legends of golden ages that came before. A world where the archaeological record has gaps and inconsistencies that we gloss over because they don't fit our preferred narrative. What if those gaps aren't accidents? What if they're scars? Evidence of resets that happen so completely, so thoroughly, that they erased almost everything, leaving only traces and echoes and fragments of memory embedded in myth. Let me take you deeper. There's a geological layer that scientists call the Younger Dryas boundary. It's a distinct line in the Earth's sediment, dated to approximately 12,800 years ago, and it marks one of the most dramatic climate shifts in recent planetary history. Temperatures plummeted. Ice sheets that were retreating suddenly advanced again. Sea levels changed. Entire species went extinct. And it happened fast. Not over thousands of years, but over decades. Maybe even years. The Younger Dryas period lasted for about 1,300 years. A brief ice age in the middle of what should have been a steady warming trend. And then it ended just as abruptly as it began. Temperatures shot back up. The ice melted. Sea levels rose by hundreds of feet in a geological instant. Coastlines that had been dry land for millennia were suddenly underwater. Now, if you were a civilization living on those coastlines, which is where most civilizations tend to settle because coastlines provide access to resources and trade routes and fertile land, what do you think would happen to you when the ocean suddenly rose and swallowed your cities? You'd flee inland. You'd lose everything. Your buildings, your libraries, your records, your infrastructure. All of it would be buried underwater. And even if some of your people survived, even if they carried some knowledge with them to higher ground, they'd be scattered, disconnected, forced to start over in unfamiliar territory with only fragments of what they once knew. And this is just one event, one reset. The Younger Dryas is the most recent dramatic climate shift, but it's not the only one. The Earth has gone through cycles of heating and cooling, glaciation and interglacial periods, for millions of years. And during each of these cycles, sea levels have risen and fallen by hundreds of feet, which means that any coastal civilization that might have existed during a glacial period, when sea levels were lower and the coastlines were in completely different places than they are now, would be underwater today. Unreachable. Invisible to our surveys and excavations. We've explored less than 5% of the ocean floor. Think about that. We've mapped the surface of Mars in more detail than we've mapped the bottom of our own oceans. And in the small fraction that we have explored, we've found things that make us question our assumptions. Structures that look too geometric to be natural. Formations that resemble roads and walls and foundations. Are they proof of ancient civilizations? Most scientists say no. They're natural formations, they say. Quirks of geology. And maybe they're right. But maybe they're not. Maybe we're just not ready to accept what the evidence might be telling us. Because accepting it would mean rewriting everything. It would mean admitting that the timeline we've constructed for human history is incomplete at best and fundamentally wrong at worst. It would mean acknowledging that we might not be the first advanced civilization on this planet. That others might have come before us, risen to heights we can only imagine, and then fallen so completely that almost nothing of them remains. And that's a humbling thought. Terrifying thought. Because if it happened to them, it could happen to us. Think about that. You're sitting here right now, in a world that feels permanent, solid. Your city or town or wherever you are feels like it's always been there and always will be. You have access to more information than any human in history. You can communicate with people on the other side of the planet instantly. You can fly through the air in metal tubes and see things that your ancestors would have considered magic. You're living at what feels like the pinnacle of human achievement. And yet, all of it, every single bit of it, is more fragile than you want to believe. It exists because people remember how to make it exist. Because knowledge is being actively preserved and transmitted and taught. But knowledge isn't permanent. It's not carved into the structure of reality. It's stored in brains and books and servers, and all of those things can be destroyed. All of those things can be forgotten. There's a facility in Norway called the Global Seed Vault. It's built into the side of a mountain on an island near the Arctic Circle, and it contains seeds. Millions of seeds from crops all over the world, preserved in frozen storage, protected from war and disaster and time. They're just in case. Just in case something happens that wipes out our agricultural knowledge or destroys our crops or resets our ability to feed ourselves. The people who built it understand something important. That civilization is not inevitable. That the things we take for granted can disappear. That we need backups. But here's the question that keeps me up at night. What if we already are the backup? What if the Global Seed Vault isn't the first time humans have tried to preserve knowledge against catastrophe? What if there were other vaults, other libraries, other repositories of wisdom built by previous iterations of civilization, and they failed? What if they were destroyed or buried or lost, and we're now trying to do the same thing they tried? Hoping for a different outcome but following the same patterns, the same cycles, the same inevitable march toward complexity and fragility and collapse. The ancient Library of Alexandria is often held up as one of the great tragedies of history. It contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls, works of literature and science and philosophy from across the known world, and it was destroyed. Burned most likely, though the exact circumstances are unclear. And with it, an enormous amount of human knowledge was lost. We know the names of some of the works that were in that library because other sources reference them, but the texts themselves are gone. Completely. Forever. We'll never know what they said. We'll never recover that knowledge. It's as if it never existed. Now imagine that on a larger scale. Not one library but hundreds. Not one city but thousands. An entire global civilization with its own science and technology and understanding of the world. All of it lost because the knowledge wasn't preserved in a way that could survive catastrophe. Maybe they stored it on materials that degraded over time. Maybe they relied too heavily on oral tradition. And when the people who held that tradition died, it died with them. Maybe they did have ways of preserving knowledge, but those methods required infrastructure or materials that became unavailable after whatever event reset them. The result is the same. The knowledge disappears. And a few thousand years later, the descendants of that civilization are building pyramids again, inventing writing again, discovering mathematics again, unaware that their ancestors already did all of this before. It's called the Lindy effect. The idea that the longer something has survived, the longer it's likely to continue surviving. A book that's been in print for 100 years is more likely to still be in print 100 years from now than a book that was published yesterday. A tradition that's been practiced for 1,000 years is more likely to be practiced for another 1,000 years than a tradition that started last week. The principle applies to ideas, to institutions, to civilizations. The longer we've been around, the longer we're likely to continue being around. But there's a corollary to that effect that we don't like to think about. Everything that has survived a long time has also survived by being adaptable, by changing, by shedding parts of itself that no longer serve it. And sometimes what gets shed is memory. What gets lost is the knowledge of where we came from. Human beings are exceptionally good at forgetting. We forget personal experiences, even traumatic ones, given enough time. We forget languages if we stop speaking them. We forget skills if we stop practicing them. And civilizations, which are just collections of human beings, forget too. We forget why we do certain things. We forget the origins of our traditions. We forget the lessons our ancestors learned through suffering and trial and error. And then we make the same mistakes again. We rediscover the same truths. We rebuild the same structures. We follow the same patterns. There's a concept in computer science called a hard reset. It's when you force a system to reboot by cutting all power to it, wiping its volatile memory, and starting fresh from the most basic initialization state. The system doesn't remember what it was doing before. It doesn't retain any of the processes that were running or the data that was being worked on. It just starts over, as if it's the first time it's ever been turned on. And the thing about hard resets is that they're sometimes necessary. Sometimes a system gets so corrupted or unstable or locked into a state that can't be fixed with normal methods that the only option is to wipe everything and start fresh. What if that's what happens to civilizations? What if there's some threshold of complexity or instability or corruption beyond which a civilization can't continue, and the only way forward is reset? Not necessarily through violence or war or intentional destruction, but through some kind of systemic collapse that's built into the nature of complex systems themselves. A cascade failure that propagates through every level of society until nothing remains but the biological basics. Humans who need food and shelter and safety. Humans who have to relearn how to provide those things without the infrastructure they once relied on. We've seen small-scale versions of this throughout recorded history. The Bronze Age collapse is a famous example. Around 1200 BCE, most of the advanced civilizations in the Mediterranean and Near East suddenly collapsed within a span of about 50 years. The Hittite Empire fell. Mycenaean Greece disintegrated. The Egyptian New Kingdom weakened drastically. Trade networks that had existed for centuries vanished. Writing systems were forgotten. Cities were abandoned. And the people who survived entered what historians call a Dark Age, a period of several centuries where cultural development stagnated or regressed, where the achievements of the previous era were lost or survived only in garbled form. We eventually recovered. New civilizations arose. But the knowledge of how the Bronze Age civilizations functioned, what their daily lives were like, what they knew and understood about the world, much of that is gone forever. And that's just one example from a period where we do have some written records, where we can at least try to piece together what happened. Go back further into prehistory, and the collapses become invisible. They leave no written record because writing hasn't been invented yet, or if it was invented, it's in a form we can't recognize or a medium that hasn't survived. All we have are the physical remains, and those physical remains only survive under very specific conditions. Don't last. Metal can last if it's not corroded. But organic materials, wood and cloth and paper and leather, they decay. They disappear. Within a few hundred years, sometimes less, there's nothing left of them. So if a civilization existed that built primarily with wood, that wrote on materials that degraded, that stored their knowledge in forms that required active maintenance to preserve, we would have almost no evidence of them. A few stone foundations, perhaps. Some pottery shards. Maybe some metal tools if they used metal. But nothing that would tell us they were advanced. Nothing that would indicate they had philosophy or science or art or any of the things we associate with civilization. They would be invisible to archaeology. Ghosts in the timeline. This isn't speculation. This is fact. We know that civilizations can disappear almost completely. The Indus Valley Civilization, also called the Harappan Civilization, was one of the largest and most advanced urban cultures of the ancient world. At its peak, around 2500 BCE, it covered an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. It had planned cities with sophisticated drainage systems, standardized weights and measures, possibly even a form of writing. And then, around 1900 BCE, it declined. The cities were gradually abandoned. The writing, if it was writing, was forgotten. And for thousands of years, no one knew it had existed. It wasn't rediscovered until the 1920s, when archaeologists started excavating the sites. We still can't read their script. We don't know what language they spoke. We don't know why they collapsed. They're a mystery, and they only disappeared 3,000 years ago. 3,000 years is nothing. It's barely a chapter in the human story. And yet, an entire civilization can be forgotten in that span of time. Now think about 10,000 years, 20,000, 50,000. How many civilizations could rise and fall in that kind of time span and leave virtually no trace? How many cycles of growth and collapse and rebirth could occur before we even started keeping the kind of records that might survive? And here's where it gets really strange. Here's where the ground starts to shift beneath your feet. What if the resets aren't just random? What if they're not just the result of natural disasters or climate shifts or societal collapse? What if there's a pattern to them, a regularity, a cycle that operates on timescales so vast that we can't perceive it from our limited vantage point? The ancients seemed to think so. They spoke of great years and world ages and cycles that repeated like the seasons but on a cosmic scale. The precession of the equinoxes, for example, is a real astronomical phenomenon where the Earth's axis slowly wobbles like a spinning top, completing one full cycle approximately every 26,000 years. Many ancient cultures were aware of this precession and incorporated it into their cosmologies and calendars. They saw it as a great cosmic clock, marking vast periods of time that correlated with rises and falls of civilizations. Were they onto something? Or were they just projecting meaning onto natural phenomena the way humans tend to do? There's a researcher named Graham Hancock who has spent decades exploring these questions. He's controversial in academic circles, often dismissed as a pseudo-archaeologist, but his central thesis is hard to ignore: that there was an advanced global civilization that existed during the last ice age and was largely destroyed by the cataclysms that ended that ice age around 12,000 years ago. He points to the same anomalies I've mentioned: the ancient structures that seem too old, the myths that seem too consistent across cultures, the geological evidence of dramatic climate shifts. And he asks the question that mainstream archaeology refuses to seriously entertain: what if we're not the first? The academic establishment has reasons for rejecting this idea. Good reasons in some cases. There's no smoking gun. No single piece of evidence that conclusively proves a lost civilization existed. And extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially when we've only excavated a tiny fraction of the planet, and when we know that the conditions necessary to preserve evidence are rare and specific. Most of human activity leaves no permanent mark. Most of what we build will crumble and decay and be reclaimed by nature within a few centuries if we're not actively maintaining it. So the lack of widespread, obvious evidence of ancient advanced civilizations doesn't necessarily mean they didn't exist. It might just mean they didn't leave the kind of evidence we're looking for, or that their evidence is in places we haven't looked, or that we're not recognizing their evidence when we see it because it doesn't match our expectations. Consider the Antikythera mechanism. It's an ancient Greek device, recovered from a shipwreck, dated to around 200 BCE. And it's an analog computer, a mechanical device with dozens of gears that could calculate astronomical positions and predict eclipses. It's so sophisticated that nothing comparable appears in the historical record for over 1,000 years after it was made. When it was first discovered, no one could believe it was real. It seemed impossible that ancient Greeks could have built something like that. It didn't fit the narrative. But it is real. It exists. And it proves that our understanding of what ancient people were capable of has been, at times, drastically wrong. If we found one Antikythera mechanism, what else might be out there that we haven't found yet? What other technologies or knowledge systems might have existed that didn't survive or that we haven't recognized? And if this can happen within recorded history, within a civilization we think we understand relatively well, what might have happened in the vast stretches of prehistory that we understand hardly at all? Let's go back to the reset scenario I described at the beginning. Everyone wakes up and the knowledge is gone. Not the people, not the physical world, just the knowledge. What would actually happen in the decades and centuries that followed? First, chaos, panic, a scramble to survive as all the systems we depend on break down. But humans are adaptable. We're survivors. We'd figure out the basics again. Agriculture, toolmaking, social organization. We'd rebuild, but we'd rebuild differently because we'd be starting from a different point with different resources. And some things would be lost. Not just technology but also context. The understanding of why things were the way they were. Future generations would look at the ruins of our cities and wonder what kind of people built them. They'd invent stories to explain it. Legends. And those stories would drift further and further from the truth with each retelling until they became unrecognizable. Sound familiar? This is what mythology might actually be. Not primitive superstition but degraded history. Memories of real events and real people and real achievements that got filtered through thousands of years of oral transmission and cultural evolution until they became stories about gods and heroes and monsters. The flood myths that appear in cultures around the world, for instance. Nearly every ancient civilization has a story about a great flood that destroyed the world. The biblical Noah, the Sumerian Utnapishtim, the Hindu Manu, the Greek Deucalion, the Aztec Coxcoxtli. Different names, different details, but the same basic story. The world was flooded, almost everyone died, a handful of survivors repopulate the earth. Why is this story so universal? The standard explanation is that floods are common natural disasters, and humans naturally create stories to make sense of them. But what if it's not that simple? What if these stories are all echoes of the same event? A real catastrophic flood that occurred at the end of the last ice age when the ice sheets melted and sea levels rose dramatically? What if the survivors of that flood scattered across the world and carried the memory of it with them? And that memory got woven into the foundational myths of every culture they influenced. We know that massive flooding did occur around that time. Geological evidence is clear. The melting ice caused sea levels to rise by over 300 feet. Coastlines that had been inhabited for thousands of years were inundated. The Black Sea, for example, is thought to have been a freshwater lake until around 5500 BCE, when rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosporus and flooded it in what must have been a cataclysmic event for anyone living around its shores. Imagine experiencing that. You're part of a thriving community living beside a lake, and then over the course of days or weeks, the lake starts rising. Not slowly, but rapidly, violently, as millions of gallons of seawater pour in through a breach in the land. Your entire world is swallowed. You flee with whatever you can carry. Your home, your fields, your community, everything you know is gone. Wouldn't that leave a mark on your culture? Wouldn't the survivors tell their children about it? And wouldn't those children tell their children? And wouldn't the story eventually become mythologized, transformed into a tale about divine punishment and salvation and the fragility of human existence. This is how resets propagate through time. Not just as physical destruction, but as cultural trauma that gets encoded into story. And the stories last longer than the artifacts. They last longer than the buildings. They last as long as there are people to tell them, which means they can survive multiple cycles, carrying information across the gaps, across the resets, in a form that's malleable enough to adapt to new contexts but stable enough to retain core truths. But there's a problem with stories. They change. They merge with other stories. They get embellished and simplified and interpreted and reinterpreted until extracting the original truth becomes nearly impossible. It's like playing a game of telephone across centuries. The message degrades with each transmission. So if we're trying to understand whether civilizations have been reset before, whether this has all happened in cycles, we can't rely on mythology alone. We need something more solid. We need physical evidence. And that's where things get really interesting, because when you start looking for physical evidence of cycles, of resets, you start seeing patterns in places you didn't expect. There's a layer of sediment in the geological record called the iridium layer. It's found all over the world, dated to 65 million years ago, and it contains unusually high concentrations of iridium, an element that's rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids. This layer is the primary evidence for the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs. The asteroid hit, the impact threw debris into the atmosphere. Iridium from the asteroid rained down globally, and it settled into a distinct layer that we can now identify in rock formations everywhere. It's a global reset marker, a line in the Earth's history that says, before this point, dinosaurs. After this point, no dinosaurs. Now, there are other layers in the geological record. Not as dramatic as the iridium layer, but still notable. Layers that indicate rapid environmental changes, mass extinction events, sudden shifts in climate or sea level or atmospheric composition. And some of these layers correspond to interesting points in human prehistory. The younger Dryas boundary layer I mentioned earlier is one. There's evidence of increased cosmic dust in that layer, which has led some researchers to propose that a comet or asteroid impact or airburst event might have triggered the climate shift. Not a planet-killing impact like the one that ended the dinosaurs, but something significant enough to disrupt the environment, to cause widespread wildfires, to throw enough material into the atmosphere to affect global temperatures. If that happened, if there was an impact event 12,000 years ago, and if there were human civilizations existing at that time, they would have been devastated. Not necessarily wiped out entirely, but reset, knocked back, forced to start over. This is speculative. I want to be clear about that. The impact hypothesis for the younger Dryas is not universally accepted. There are scientists who argue that the evidence doesn't support it, that the climate shift can be explained by other mechanisms. But the fact that it's even being seriously discussed, the fact that there is evidence that makes the hypothesis plausible, should give us pause. Because if it happened once, it could happen again. And if it could happen again, it might have happened before. Multiple times. Leaving markers in the geological record that we might not have recognized yet because we're not looking for them, or because they've been obscured by time and erosion and tectonic activity. The Earth is not a static archive. It's a dynamic system. Continents move. Mountains rise and erode. Sediments get buried and compressed and thrust back up to the surface. The planet recycles itself over millions of years, and in the process, it erases its own history. The oldest rocks on Earth's surface are only about 4 billion years old, even though the planet is 4.5 billion years old. The first half-billion years of Earth's history is almost completely missing from the geological record because those rocks have been destroyed or altered beyond recognition. And if that much of the planet's history can be erased by natural processes, how much of human history might be hidden in the parts of the record we can't access or haven't properly interpreted? There are places on Earth where the crust has been subducted back into the mantle, taking everything on its surface down with it. There are places where volcanic activity has buried landscapes under kilometers of lava and ash. There are places where ice sheets have scoured the bedrock clean, removing any trace of what might have been there before. The Earth is a machine for erasing evidence. And we're trying to reconstruct the history of a species that's only been around for a fraction of the planet's lifespan, using evidence that survives only under the rarest conditions. It's a wonder we know anything at all. And yet we do know some things. We know that humans are capable of extraordinary achievements. We know that we're capable of building complex societies, of creating art and science and philosophy, of organizing ourselves into cities and nations and civilizations. We know that we've done this at least once in the past few thousand years. The question is, have we done it before? And if we have, how many times? Think about the sheer improbability of consciousness, of a universe that started as a hot, dense point and expanded into galaxies and stars and planets, and on at least one of those planets, maybe more, matter organized itself into configurations complex enough to be aware of their own existence, to ask questions, to seek answers, to wonder about their place in the cosmos. That's what you are. A configuration of matter that can think about itself, that can contemplate the history of the universe and its own origins and the possibility that it might not be the first time this has happened. Consciousness is a flame. It requires fuel and oxygen and a spark to ignite, and it can be extinguished by any number of things. Strong wind, lack of fuel, flood. And once it's extinguished, starting it again requires the same conditions, the same careful assembly of materials and circumstances. But once you know that fire is possible, once you've seen it burn, you know it can be created again. You know the pattern. Maybe that's what civilization is. Pattern. A flame that ignites when the conditions are right, burns for a while, sometimes brightly, sometimes dimly, and then goes out. And the materials that fed it, the wood and the fuel, they're still there. They get scattered and mixed with other materials. And eventually, given enough time, the conditions align again. Spark catches. The flame returns. And it burns in a shape that's not identical to the previous flame but similar enough that you can recognize it for what it is. We're the flame right now, burning brightly, consuming resources at a rate that's unprecedented in known history, spreading across the planet, reaching out into space. And we feel like we're special, like we're the first and only flame. Like this is what the universe has been building toward. But what if we're just the latest iteration? What if the universe has been running this experiment for billions of years on billions of planets, igniting flames of consciousness, watching them burn and go out, and then igniting them again over and over, with slight variations each time, testing different configurations, different paths, different outcomes? Let that sit with you. Because if that's true, if consciousness and civilization are patterns that repeat across time and space, then the reset of human civilization isn't an anomaly. It's not a worst-case scenario. It's just part of the process, part of the cycle. The flame goes out and eventually it comes back. And each time it comes back, it has the potential to burn differently, to learn different lessons, to make different mistakes, to reach different heights before it extinguishes again. This might sound nihilistic, like nothing we do matters because it's all just going to reset anyway. But I don't think that's the right way to look at it. Because even if the flame goes out, even if our specific civilization doesn't last forever, the pattern persists. The knowledge that civilization is possible persists. It's encoded not just in our myths and stories but in the structure of reality itself. In the laws of physics that allow complex organization. In the chemistry that enables life. In the evolution that produces beings capable of thought. Those things don't reset. Those things are fundamental. Which means that even if we lose everything, even if every city crumbles and every book burns and every hard drive corrupts, the potential to rebuild is still there. The universe will still permit consciousness. The earth will still provide resources. And humans, or whatever comes after humans, will still have the capacity to ask questions and seek answers and build civilizations. The reset, if it happens, isn't the end. It's a transition. Transformation. A shedding of old forms to make room for new ones. And maybe that's necessary. Maybe civilizations, like organisms, have lifespans. Maybe they grow and mature and eventually senesce, becoming rigid and fragile and unable to adapt. And the only way forward is to clear the board and start fresh. Not because the old civilization was bad or wrong, but because it had exhausted its potential. Because it had explored all the paths available to it and reached a point where further development wasn't possible without a fundamental restructuring. We see this in smaller systems all the time. Forests go through succession cycles. A fire clears the old growth, and new species colonize the burned area. And eventually, the forest regrows, but it's not the same forest. It's a new forest with different species composition, different age structure, different ecological dynamics. But it's still a forest. The pattern persists even as the specific details change. And if forests can do this, if ecosystems can do this, why not civilizations? There's a concept in systems theory called self-organized criticality. It describes systems that naturally evolve toward a critical state where small perturbations can trigger large-scale reorganizations. Think of a sand pile. You keep adding grains of sand, and the pile grows and it seems stable, but it's actually poised right at the edge of stability. And then one more grain lands in just the right spot, and it triggers an avalanche. The pile collapses, reorganizes, and then starts building again. Civilizations might work the same way. We keep adding complexity and infrastructure and interconnections, and we feel like we're building something permanent, but we're actually approaching a critical threshold. And when we cross that threshold, when the system becomes too complex or too interconnected or too fragile, a small shock can cascade through the entire structure, causing a collapse that resets everything. The thing about self-organized criticality is that it's not a bug. It's a feature. It's how complex systems explore possibility space. They build up, they collapse, they build up again in a different configuration. And through this process, they sample different organizational states, different solutions to the problem of how to exist in a changing environment. It's inefficient in the short term. Collapses are wasteful. They destroy resources and information. But in the long term, it might be the only way for systems to adapt and evolve on the timescales necessary to survive in a dynamic universe. So maybe resets are how civilizations evolve. Not through smooth, continuous progress, but through cycles of growth and collapse and regrowth. Each cycle builds on the previous one in subtle ways, incorporating lessons from the past even if those lessons are encoded in forms we don't consciously recognize. The myths, the archetypes, the psychological structures that shape how we think and organize ourselves. These things carry information across resets, allowing each new iteration of civilization to start from a slightly higher baseline than the last. Or maybe not. Maybe each reset wipes the slate completely clean, and we start from zero every time, making the same discoveries, the same inventions, the same mistakes, in an endless loop that goes nowhere. Just a cosmic Groundhog Day playing out on a planetary scale with no memory of the previous iterations and no escape from the cycle. I don't know which version is true. I don't think anyone knows. But I find the first option, the one where we're learning and evolving even through the resets, more compelling, because it gives meaning to the struggle. It suggests that even if our specific civilization doesn't last, even if we're heading toward a reset that we can't prevent, what we do now still matters. The knowledge we create, the art we make, the kindness we show, the problems we solve, all of it feeds into the pattern. All of it becomes part of the substrate that the next iteration will build on, even if they don't know they're building on it. This is the strange hope that comes from contemplating civilizational resets. Not the naive hope that we can avoid them, but the deeper hope that they're not the end. That life and consciousness and civilization are more resilient than we think. That the universe wants these things to exist and has built mechanisms to ensure they keep recurring, keep experimenting, keep reaching toward something we can't yet articulate. But there's also a responsibility that comes with this perspective. If we're not the first civilization, if others have come before us and fallen, then we have an obligation to learn from their failures, to look for the patterns that lead to collapse and try to avoid them, to ask ourselves, what can we do differently? What can we preserve? What can we pass on to whoever comes next? Whether that's our direct descendants or some future iteration of humanity or consciousness that we can't even imagine yet. One answer is to build things that last. Not just physical monuments, though those have their place, but knowledge systems that are robust and redundant and distributed. We need to encode what we know in multiple forms and multiple locations so that no single catastrophe can erase it all. Stone carvings, metal tablets, satellite archives, DNA-based storage, oral traditions, mathematical truths that can be rediscovered through observation, scientific principles that are baked into the structure of reality and don't require cultural continuity to be found again. We need to create a civilizational backup system that can survive resets and help future humans restart with a running start. Some people are already working on this. The Long Now Foundation, for example, is building a clock designed to run for 10,000 years, ticking once per year, chiming once per century, and Kukuanji once per millennium. It's not just a clock. It's a monument to long-term thinking, a statement that we care about the far future, that we're willing to build things that will outlast us by thousands of years. There are also efforts to create archives of human knowledge that can survive catastrophes. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault I mentioned earlier. The Memory of Mankind project, which stores information on ceramic tablets in an Austrian salt mine, protected from environmental degradation and readable without technology. The GitHub Arctic Code Vault, which stores open-source code on film reels in a decommissioned coal mine in the Arctic, designed to last 1,000 years. These projects are amazing. They're noble, but they're also tiny, fragmentary. They represent a fraction of human knowledge. And they all assume that future humans will be able to find them, access them, and understand them. That's not a given. If a reset is severe enough, if it scatters populations and erases languages and disrupts cultural continuity, even the best-intentioned archive might become inaccessible. A future archaeologist might stumble upon the Arctic Code Vault and have no idea what it is or how to read the film reels. It would just be another mysterious artifact from a lost civilization. So maybe the answer isn't to preserve knowledge externally. Maybe it's to preserve the capacity to rediscover knowledge internally. To focus on education and critical thinking and scientific literacy, so that even if we lose the specific facts, we retain the methods for finding them again. The scientific method doesn't care about cultural continuity. It's a process, a way of asking questions and testing answers. And it works because it's based on observation of the natural world, which doesn't reset. The laws of physics are the same before and after civilizational collapse. Gravity still pulls. Chemistry still reacts. Mathematics still describes relationships. If we can teach people how to observe, how to experiment, how to reason, then even if they lose our databases and libraries, they can rebuild the knowledge base from scratch. It'll take time. It'll be slow. But it's possible. And that might be the most important thing we can pass on. Not a list of facts, but a way of thinking. Not answers, but the tools to find answers. Because resets might be inevitable, but ignorance isn't. As long as there are conscious beings asking questions, knowledge will accumulate. Slowly, sometimes painfully, but it will accumulate. And each accumulation brings the potential for new insights, new technologies, new forms of organization that might, just might, push us past the critical threshold where resets are necessary. Or maybe I'm being too optimistic. Maybe resets aren't about civilizations reaching a certain complexity and then needing to collapse. Maybe they're external, cosmic, the result of forces beyond our control or understanding. Asteroid impacts, gamma-ray bursts, supervolcanic eruptions, solar flares, pandemics, any number of existential threats that don't care about our level of development or our good intentions. In which case, all the knowledge preservation and critical thinking in the world won't save us. We'll be reset by the universe simply because we were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And all we can do is hope that enough survives to give the next iteration a chance. This is the darker possibility. That resets are random. That there's no lesson to learn because there's no pattern to discern. That we're just fragile biological machines living on a fragile rocky planet orbiting a medium-sized star in a violent universe that occasionally does violent things. And sometimes those things hit us and we're gone. And there's no meaning to it beyond the raw physics of impact and destruction. But even if that's true, even if resets are random cosmic events, the response is the same. We build. We learn. We create. We try to make the time we have matter, not because it will prevent the reset, but because that's what conscious beings do. We reach toward complexity and meaning and beauty, even in the face of entropy and chaos and eventual dissolution. We're pattern-seeking, pattern-making creatures. And we'll keep making patterns until we can't anymore. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the act of creating civilization, of building knowledge, of reaching toward understanding, is itself the point. Not the destination, but the journey. Not the preservation, but the experience of being alive and aware and engaged with the mystery of existence. There's a thought experiment called the Boltzmann brain. It's based on a paradox in thermodynamics and cosmology. The basic idea is that in an infinite universe with infinite time, random fluctuations in quantum fields could spontaneously create a conscious mind, fully formed, complete with false memories of a past that never existed. This Boltzmann brain would exist for a brief moment before dissipating back into the void, but during that moment, it would believe it was real, that it had a history, that it was part of a larger world. And the paradox is that in an infinite universe, it's statistically more likely that any given conscious observer is a Boltzmann brain than a real, evolved being with an actual past. Now, we don't think we're Boltzmann brains. The universe doesn't appear to be infinite in the right way for this to be a real concern. But the thought experiment raises an interesting question. How do we know our memories are real? How do we know that the history we think we have actually happened? We trust archaeological evidence and historical records, but those can be faked or misinterpreted. We trust our own memories, But memories are notoriously unreliable, subject to revision and reconstruction every time we recall them. If a reset erased everyone's memory of the previous civilization and implanted false memories of a primitive past, how would we know? What test could we run to distinguish true history from implanted history? I'm not suggesting this has actually happened, but the question illustrates how fragile our sense of continuity really is. We assume the past was the way we remember it, the way it's recorded, but that assumption rests on trust. Trust in our cognitive faculties. Trust in the reliability of physical evidence. Trust that the universe is consistent and doesn't play tricks on us. And mostly that trust is warranted. The universe does seem to be consistent. The evidence does seem to be reliable. But every now and then we find something that doesn't fit. An anomaly. An artifact that's older than it should be or more advanced than it should be or in a location where it shouldn't exist. And we have to decide. Do we revise our understanding of history to accommodate the anomaly? Or do we dismiss the anomaly as an error, a misidentification, a contamination of the data? Science tends toward the latter. It's conservative by design. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Don't multiply entities beyond necessity. Occam's razor. These are good principles. They protect us from falling into conspiracy thinking and pseudoscience and believing every fringe theory that comes along. But they also make it hard to recognize genuine paradigm shifts when they're necessary. There was a time when the idea of continental drift was considered fringe pseudoscience. Alfred Wegener proposed it in the early 20th century, pointing to the way coastlines seemed to fit together and the way similar fossils appeared on continents separated by oceans. But the scientific establishment rejected it because there was no known mechanism that could move continents. It wasn't until the 1960s, when the theory of plate tectonics provided that mechanism, that continental drift became accepted. Wegener was right all along, but he died decades before his ideas were vindicated. How many other ideas are currently dismissed as fringe that might turn out to be true? How many researchers are pointing to anomalies, to pieces of evidence that don't fit the standard narrative, and being ignored or ridiculed because their claims seem too extraordinary? Maybe most of them are wrong. Probably most of them are wrong. But maybe some of them are seeing something real. Something that will force us to revise our understanding of history once we finally accumulate enough evidence to overcome our skepticism. The question of whether civilizations have been reset before is one of those ideas. Sounds fringe. Sounds like pseudo-archaeology. And maybe it is. Maybe there's no truth to it whatsoever. And the mainstream narrative is correct. And humans really have only developed advanced civilization once in the past 10,000 years. But the evidence, such as it is suggestive enough that we shouldn't dismiss the question entirely. We should keep looking, keep questioning, keep being open to the possibility that our history is stranger and more complex than we currently believe. Because if there's even a chance that resets have happened before, then understanding how and why they happen becomes crucial. It could tell us something about the vulnerabilities of civilization, about the warning signs to watch for, about the resilient strategies that might help us survive the next one if there is a next one. And even if it turns out we're wrong, even if we're the first and only advanced civilization this planet has produced, the exercise of thinking about resets, of contemplating how fragile our complex systems are, is valuable in itself. It makes us more humble, more cautious, more aware of the impermanence of everything we've built. There's a Japanese aesthetic concept called mono no aware. It's often translated as the pathos of things, or the bittersweet awareness of impermanence. It's the feeling you get when you see cherry blossoms blooming, knowing they'll only last a few days before they fall. The beauty is inseparable from the transience. The knowledge that it won't last is what makes it precious. And maybe that's how we should think about civilization. Not as something permanent that we're building to last forever, but as something beautiful and temporary that we're privileged to be part of for a brief moment in cosmic time. We're the cherry blossoms. We bloom brilliantly for a season, and then we fall, and new blossoms will eventually bloom again. And that's not tragic. That's just the nature of things. Accepting impermanence doesn't mean giving up or becoming nihilistic. It means appreciating what we have while we have it. It means working to make our brief bloom as beautiful and meaningful as possible, not because it will last forever, but because it matters now. Because the experience of being alive, of being conscious, of being part of a civilization that asks questions about its own existence and origins and fate, that experience has intrinsic value regardless of how long it persists. And maybe there's another layer to this. Maybe the resets, if they're real, aren't just destructive. Maybe they're also creative. Maybe they're the universe's way of experimenting with different forms of consciousness and civilization. Each reset shuffles the deck. Each new civilization starts with a slightly different set of initial conditions, develops in different ways, explores different possibilities. And through this process of variation and selection, the universe learns. Not in the sense of a conscious entity learning, but in the sense of a complex system exploring state space. Trying out different configurations, seeing what works and what doesn't, gradually evolving toward something. We don't know what. Maybe there's no goal. Maybe it's exploration for its own sake. Or maybe there is a goal, some optimal configuration of matter and energy and information that the universe is groping toward through these cycles of creation and destruction. That's purely speculative. I have no evidence for it. But it's a thought that brings a strange kind of comfort. The idea that even if our civilization resets, even if we lose everything, it's not meaningless. It's part of a larger process. A cosmic algorithm running in the background of reality, testing hypotheses about how consciousness and complexity can manifest in a material universe. We're one data point, one experiment, and when the experiment concludes, the results get fed back into the system, and the next experiment begins with that information incorporated somehow, even if only implicitly. Or maybe I'm just making up stories to cope with the existential dread of contemplating civilizational collapse. That's possible too. Humans are very good at creating narratives that make us feel better about things we can't control. It's one of our most useful adaptations. We tell stories about meaning and purpose and continuity because those stories help us function in a world that's fundamentally uncertain and dangerous. And maybe that's fine. Maybe the truth of the story matters less than the function it serves. If believing that resets are part of a larger cosmic process helps us appreciate our existence more fully and work harder to preserve what's valuable, then it's a useful story, even if it's not literally true. But let me bring this back to something more concrete, something more immediate. Because whether or not civilizational resets have happened before, whether or not they're part of some cosmic cycle, the fact remains that our current civilization is facing very real challenges that could, in the worst case, lead to a reset-like scenario. Climate change, resource depletion, nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, asteroid impacts, pandemics. We're living through a period of accelerating risk, where the technologies we've developed give us unprecedented power but also unprecedented vulnerability. We can alter the planet's climate, but we can also destabilize it. We can cure diseases, but we can also create new ones. We can connect billions of people through global networks, but we can also make those networks targets for disruption. The more complex our civilization becomes, the more interdependent its parts, the more fragile it becomes to certain kinds of shocks. A cyber attack that takes down power grids. A pandemic that overwhelms healthcare systems. Cascading failure in financial markets. Any of these could trigger effects that ripple through the entire global system, causing breakdowns in supply chains, communication, governance. And if multiple shocks happen at once, if they compound and reinforce each other, the result could be a collapse that looks a lot like a reset. Not necessarily a complete wipeout of humanity, but a drastic simplification of society. A loss of technological capacity. A fragmentation of global civilization into smaller, isolated groups struggling to survive with whatever resources they can scrounge from the ruins. This isn't science fiction. It's a plausible scenario based on how complex systems behave under stress. And the scary part is that it doesn't require malice or intention. It can happen through sheer accident and mismanagement and the accumulation of small failures that suddenly cross a threshold. We're playing a high-stakes game with systems we don't fully understand, and the rules keep changing as the systems evolve. And we're doing it all while being distracted by short-term concerns, by political squabbles and economic competition and social media and entertainment. We're not paying attention to the big picture. We're not thinking in the timescales that matter for civilizational survival. We're focused on the next quarter, the next election, the next news cycle. And meanwhile, the slow-moving disasters creep closer. But here's the thing, we can change that. We can choose to pay attention. We can choose to think long-term. We can choose to prioritize resilience and sustainability and redundancy over short-term growth and efficiency. We can choose to invest in the kinds of systems and knowledge and institutions that could help us weather the shocks that are coming. It's not inevitable that we collapse. It's not inevitable that we reset. We have agency. We have choice. The question is whether we'll exercise that choice wisely, or whether we'll keep sleepwalking toward the edge until it's too late. And that's where individual action comes in. Because civilizations are made of people. Of individuals making choices every day about what to value, what to preserve, what to work toward. You can't control what the entire civilization does. But you can control what you do. You can choose to learn, to create, teach, to build relationships and communities that are resilient and supportive, to preserve knowledge in whatever form you can, to ask questions and think critically and not just accept the narratives you're given, to appreciate the fragility and beauty of this moment in history while working to extend it as long as possible. This isn't a call to action. I said at the beginning that this is not entertainment, it's an experience. And I meant that. I'm not trying to mobilize you to do anything specific. I'm just asking you to think, contemplate, to sit with the uncomfortable possibility that everything we take for granted could vanish, and to let that possibility change how you see the world. Because once you really internalize the fragility of civilization, once you understand that it's not a given, that it's a temporary and unlikely configuration that requires constant effort to maintain, you start to see things differently. You start to value things differently. The mundane becomes precious. The everyday becomes miraculous. The fact that you can read these words, that knowledge can be transmitted across space and time through symbols on a screen, that we've built a global network of communication and computation and information sharing, all of that becomes astonishing rather than ordinary. And maybe that's the real gift of contemplating resets. Not fear but appreciation. Not despair but wonder. The knowledge that this could all end makes the fact that it exists right now more meaningful, not less. We're living in a narrow window of time where human civilization has achieved a level of complexity and connectivity and knowledge that may never be surpassed. Or maybe it will be surpassed. Maybe we're just getting started. Maybe the next 1,000 years will see achievements we can't even imagine. But we can't know. We can't predict. All we have is now. This moment. This brief flicker of consciousness in the vast darkness of time. And in this moment we're connected. You and me. Reader and writer. Both of us contemplating the same questions about existence and meaning and the nature of the reality we find ourselves in. Both of us aware that we're temporary, that our thoughts and words and lives will eventually fade. But also aware that right now, in this moment, we're here. We're thinking. We're wondering. We're part of the ongoing conversation that humanity has been having with itself since we first looked up at the stars and asked, "What is all this? Where did it come from? What does it mean?" Those questions don't have final answers. They never will. But the act of asking them, of pursuing them, of building civilizations that give us the time and resources to contemplate them, that's precious. That's worth preserving. And if a reset comes, if everything we've built crumbles and future humans have to start over, I hope they ask the same questions. I hope they look at the ruins we leave behind and wonder about us the same way we wonder about the ancient civilizations that came before. I hope they find some fragment of our knowledge, some artifact or text or encoded message, and use it to jumpstart their own journey of discovery. And I hope they build something even more beautiful than what we've built. Because that's the pattern. That's the cycle. Not just destruction and loss, but also rebirth and renewal. The phoenix rising from the ashes. The new growth emerging from the burned forest. The civilization rebuilding on the foundations of what came before. It's a pattern as old as life itself. Death and rebirth. Ending and beginning. The eternal return. And maybe, just maybe, with each return we get a little bit closer to something. Understanding. Wisdom. The ability to build civilizations that are both complex and resilient, both advanced and sustainable. The ability to navigate the dangers of our own power without destroying ourselves. The ability to answer the questions we've been asking since the beginning, and to ask new questions we haven't even thought of yet. Or maybe not. Maybe we're doomed to repeat the same cycles forever. Never learning, never progressing, just rising and falling in an endless loop. I don't know. Can't know. No one can. We're inside the system. We can't step outside and see the whole pattern. All we can do is observe the part we're in and extrapolate and hope that our extrapolations are pointing in the right direction. But even uncertainty has its value. Even not knowing is a kind of knowledge. It's the knowledge that we're small, that our perspective is limited, that the universe is vastly larger and older and stranger than we can fully comprehend. And that knowledge, that humility, that sense of our own insignificance in the face of cosmic immensity, it's grounding. Puts our problems in perspective. It reminds us that we're not the center of everything, that the universe doesn't revolve around us, that we're just one small part of something much bigger. And yet, at the same time, we matter. We matter because we're conscious, because we can think and feel and create and love and wonder, because we're the universe becoming aware of itself, at least in this small corner of space and time. We're matter that has organized itself into configurations capable of contemplating matter. We're star stuff that has learned to look back at the stars and ask where we came from. And that's extraordinary. That's miraculous. Even if it's temporary. Even if it all resets. Even if we're forgotten. The value isn't in lasting forever. The value is in existing at all. In having the experience. In being part of the grand, strange, beautiful, terrifying adventure of consciousness emerging from unconscious matter and trying to make sense of itself. So let me ask you one more time. What if civilization has been reset before? What if we're not the first? What if others have come before us, risen to heights we can only guess at, and then fallen so completely that almost nothing remains? Does it change anything? Does it change how you see the world? How you see yourself? How you think about the future? Or does it just confirm what you already suspected, deep down, in the quiet moments when you're alone with your thoughts and the facade of permanence falls away and you glimpse the underlying truth? That everything is temporary, everything is fragile, everything is held together by the thinnest threads of continuity and memory and effort. I think most of us know this already. We just don't like to think about it. We push it away. We distract ourselves. We build elaborate structures of routine and habit and assumption to shield ourselves from the awareness of our own impermanence. And that's fine. That's human. We can't live in constant awareness of fragility and mortality. We'd go insane. We need the illusion of stability to function. But every now and then, it's good to let the illusion drop. To look at the world as it actually is, rather than as we pretend it is. To acknowledge that the ground beneath our feet is not as solid as it seems. That the civilization we're part of is not eternal. That we're living through a specific moment in a long, long story that we don't fully understand and can't control. And maybe, if we do that, if we really sit with that awareness for a while, we come out the other side changed. Not paralyzed by fear, but motivated by appreciation. Not depressed by meaninglessness, but energized by the challenge of creating meaning in a universe that doesn't provide it for free. Not resigned to collapse, but committed to building and preserving and passing on whatever we can to whoever comes next. That's the choice we have. We can't control whether civilization resets. We can't prevent every disaster or solve every problem or ensure that our knowledge survives forever. But we can control how we respond to the uncertainty. We can choose to engage with it rather than ignore it. To learn from it rather than be paralyzed by it. To use it as motivation to live more fully, more intentionally, more aware of the precious, precarious gift of existence. Because in the end, that's all any of us have. This moment, this life, this brief opportunity to be conscious and aware and part of something larger than ourselves. And whether or not civilization resets, whether or not we're the first or the 50th iteration of human achievement, whether or not our knowledge survives or our names are remembered or our works endure, none of that changes the fundamental miracle of being alive right now. The day civilization was reset, if it happened, was both an ending and a beginning. The worst day in the history of those who lived through it, and the first day of a new chapter for those who came after. And if it happens again, it will be the same. An ending and a beginning. A loss and an opportunity. Closing and an opening. And in the space between, in the time we have before that day comes or doesn't come, we live. We build. We learn. We love. We create. We ask questions. We seek answers. We contemplate the mysteries of existence and the patterns of history and the possibility that we're part of a cycle so vast we can barely glimpse its shape. And we do all of this knowing that it might not last. That it probably won't last. That everything we are and everything we make will eventually crumble and fade and be forgotten. And we do it anyway. 'Cause that's what consciousness does. It reaches toward meaning and complexity and beauty even in the face of entropy and forgetting and the inevitable return to simplicity. That's the human story. That's our story. The story of a species that climbed down from the trees and looked up at the stars and decided to build civilizations and ask questions and reach for things beyond our grasp. And maybe we've done it before. Maybe we've done it many times. Maybe this is just the latest iteration of a pattern that stretches back to the beginning of our species and will continue until the end. Or maybe this is the first time. Maybe we're unique. Maybe we're the first civilization to reach this level of development, and everything that comes after depends on what we do now. Either way, the responsibility is the same. The opportunity is the same. The miracle is the same. We're here. We're conscious. We're alive. We're part of something vast and ancient and ongoing. And for this brief moment, we get to participate in it. We get to add our voice to the conversation. We get to contribute to the pattern. We get to be part of the story of consciousness in the universe. And that's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything. So think about it. Contemplate it. Let it change you. And then go live your life with the awareness that it's both infinitely precious and utterly temporary. That it matters and doesn't matter. That you're both insignificant and essential. That you're both a fleeting spark and part of an eternal flame. And if civilization resets, if everything we've built crumbles and future humans have to start over, they'll do what we did. They'll look at the fragments and wonder. They'll ask questions. They'll tell stories. They'll try to understand where they came from and where they're going. They'll build civilizations and contemplate their own fragility and reach toward the stars. And the cycle will continue. The pattern will persist. The flame will return. 'Cause that's what consciousness does. Burns. It explores. Creates. Asks why. And as long as there are beings capable of asking why, the story isn't over. It's just beginning again. The light from distant stars takes so long to reach us that when we look up at the night sky, we're not seeing the universe as it is. We're seeing it as it was. Some of those stars died millions of years ago, but their light is still traveling toward us, still crossing the vast emptiness of space, carrying information about a past that no longer exists. And we receive that light and call it the present, even though it's a ghost. Memory. An echo of something that happened so long ago that the context has completely changed. Now apply that same principle to human history, to civilization. What if everything we think we know about our past is just light from dead stars? Information that's been traveling toward us through time, distorted by the medium it passes through, filtered by the limitations of our instruments, interpreted through the lens of our current understanding. We look at ancient ruins and ancient texts and ancient myths, and we think we're seeing the past clearly. But we're not. We're seeing fragments, shadows, echoes that have bounced through thousands of years of translation and interpretation and cultural transformation. The Sumerian king list is a strange document. It's an ancient text that lists the rulers of Sumer, a civilization that flourished in Mesopotamia over 4,000 years ago. And the list starts normally enough. Kings with reasonable reign lengths. 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. But then, as you go further back in the list, the reign lengths become absurd. One king ruled for 36,000 years. Another for 43,000. The list claims that before the Great Flood, 8 kings ruled for a combined total of 241,000 years. And then the flood came, and kingship was lowered again from heaven, and the reign lengths become reasonable again. Modern scholars treat this as mythology. Obviously, they say no one lived for 30,000 years. Obviously, these numbers are symbolic or corrupted or the result of a different counting system that we don't understand. And they're probably right. But what if there's a different way to read this text? What if it's not about individual kings at all, but about dynasties? About entire civilizational periods compressed into single names? What if those impossibly long reigns represent something real, just encoded in a language we're not interpreting correctly? Or what if the flood the text refers to wasn't a single event but a metaphor for a reset? For a moment when civilization collapsed and had to be rebuilt from scratch, and the memory of what came before was so fragmented that it could only be preserved in mythological form. The list itself admits there was a discontinuity. Before the flood, one kind of kingship. After the flood, another kind. Before the reset, one type of civilization. After the reset, something different. This pattern appears everywhere. In every culture that has written records or oral traditions stretching back far enough, there's a story about a time before. Golden Age. Paradise. A world that was different and better and more advanced, and then something happened and it ended and we're living in the diminished aftermath. The Greeks had their ages of man. Gold, silver, bronze, iron, each one progressively worse than the last. The Hindus have their yugas. Satya Yuga, the age of truth, degrading through Treta and Dvapara until we reach Kali Yuga, the age of darkness we're supposedly in now. The Aztecs believed we're living in the fifth sun, the fifth world, and that 4 previous worlds were destroyed by jaguars, wind, fire, and water. Why is this story so universal? Why do cultures separated by continents and millennia all tell versions of the same narrative about ages that came before and were destroyed? The standard answer is that it's just human psychology. We romanticize the past. We create myths of lost golden ages to cope with the difficulties of the present. We project our anxieties about decline and change onto fictional histories. And sure, there's probably some truth to that. Humans do romanticize the past. We do create comforting myths. But what if it's not just psychology? What if these stories are cultural memories? Degraded, mythologized, transformed almost beyond recognition, but still carrying information about real events. Real civilizations that rose and fell before the civilizations we know about. Real resets that scattered populations and fragmented knowledge and forced humanity to rebuild from a lower baseline. There's a phenomenon in neuroscience called memory reconsolidation. Every time you remember something, you're not accessing a static recording. You're reconstructing the memory from fragments. And in the process of reconstruction, the memory can change. Details get added or removed. Emotions shift. The context gets updated based on your current state of mind. And then you store the modified version, and the next time you remember it, you're remembering the modified version, not the original. Over many iterations, a memory can drift very far from the actual event it's supposedly recording. But it still feels real, still feels true, because it's the only version you have access to. Now scale that up to the level of culture. Oral traditions passing stories from generation to generation. Each telling slightly different. Each teller adding their own emphasis, their own interpretation, their own contemporary concerns. Over hundreds of generations, over thousands of years, the stories drift. They change. They merge with other stories. They get attached to different characters and places and time periods. But underneath all the drift and distortion, there might still be a core of truth. A real event, a real catastrophe, a real reset. Just encoded in a form that's become almost unrecognizable. This is what makes studying ancient history so difficult and so fascinating. You can't take anything at face value, but you also can't dismiss anything out of hand. Every text, every artifact, every structure is a clue in a mystery that spans thousands of years. And the clues are contradictory and incomplete and embedded in contexts we don't fully understand. It's like trying to reconstruct a conversation by listening to distant echoes in a canyon. You can hear that something was said. You can catch fragments of sound. But the original words, the original meaning, that's lost. All you can do is make educated guesses and hope you're pointing in the right direction. But here's what we do know for certain. The Earth has been through dramatic changes in the time that humans have existed. We know this from geology, from climate science, from paleontology. We know that sea levels have risen and fallen by hundreds of feet. We know that ice sheets have advanced and retreated across entire continents. We know that the climate has shifted from Ice Age to interglacial period and back again multiple times. And we know that these shifts happened relatively quickly by geological standards, sometimes over mere centuries or decades. And we also know that humans were around for all of it. Not modern industrial civilization, but humans. Anatomically modern Homo sapiens have existed for at least 200,000 years, possibly longer. For most of that time, we were hunter-gatherers living in small nomadic groups, following animal migrations, gathering seasonal plants, not building permanent structures or cities or writing systems. That's the standard narrative. And it's probably mostly accurate for most populations in most places during most of that time. But most is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Because you don't need every population to develop advanced civilization. You just need one. One group in one favorable location with access to the right resources at the right time. And if that group develops something resembling civilization, if they built permanent settlements and developed agriculture and created systems of writing or record-keeping or astronomical observation, and if they existed during a period when the climate was different and the coastlines were in different places, and if they were then destroyed by the climate shifts and sea level rises that we know occurred, would we necessarily have evidence of them? Maybe. Maybe not. It depends on where they were located and what they built with and whether any of their sites are accessible to modern archaeology. Most of the research and excavation that's been done focuses on known historical sites, places where we already have some evidence of ancient occupation. We're not randomly digging everywhere. We're following clues. And if a civilization existed in a location that's now underwater or buried under kilometers of ice or sediment, we won't find them unless we get very lucky. And we have gotten lucky a few times. Göbekli Tepe, which I mentioned earlier, was discovered by accident. A farmer noticed some shaped stones in his field, and archaeologists investigated. And suddenly we had evidence of monumental architecture from 11,000 years ago, thousands of years earlier than we thought such things were possible. That discovery forced a revision of the timeline for when complex societies could have existed. And Göbekli Tepe is on dry land in a well-traveled region. How many similar sites might exist underwater or in regions we haven't thoroughly surveyed? There are claims, often dismissed by mainstream archaeology, of structures on the ocean floor that look artificial. The Yonaguni Monument off the coast of Japan is the most famous. It's a rock formation with what appear to be right angles, flat surfaces, and carved steps, all underwater at a depth that suggests it would have been above sea level during the last ice age. Geologists argue about whether it's natural or artificial. Some say it's just a quirk of how the local sandstone erodes. Others insist the features are too regular, too geometric, to be entirely natural. The debate continues, and probably will continue until someone definitively proves it one way or another. But the fact that we're even having this debate is significant. The fact that there are underwater formations that could potentially be artificial, that would have been above water during periods when humans existed, that suggests at least the possibility that coastal civilizations existed and were submerged when sea levels rose. And if that's possible in one location, it's possible in others. There could be dozens or hundreds of submerged sites scattered around the world's coastlines, and we'd never know unless we specifically looked for them. And looking is expensive and difficult, and not a high priority when the dominant narrative says there's nothing to find. This is one of the challenges of paradigm shifts in science. The current paradigm determines what questions get asked, what research gets funded, what evidence gets considered important. And if the current paradigm says that advanced civilization only developed in the last 10,000 years, then finding evidence of earlier civilizations becomes unlikely because no one's seriously looking for it. The evidence has to be so overwhelming, so undeniable, that it forces a paradigm shift. And that kind of evidence is rare. Most evidence is ambiguous, can be interpreted multiple ways. And in the absence of clear proof, the default position is to stick with the existing paradigm. But paradigms do shift. They shift when enough anomalies accumulate that the old framework can't accommodate them anymore. When the contradictions become too glaring to ignore. When a new framework emerges that explains the anomalies better than the old one. And maybe we're approaching that point with human prehistory. Maybe the anomalies are starting to pile up. The structures that are too old. The myths that are too consistent. The geological evidence of catastrophes that coincide with mysterious gaps in the archaeological record. Maybe in 50 years or 100 years, the idea that previous civilizations existed and were reset won't seem so fringe. Maybe it'll be the new paradigm, and people will look back at our current resistance to it the way we look back at the resistance to continental drift. Or maybe not. Maybe we're wrong. Maybe the evidence we think is suggestive is just coincidence and misinterpretation. Maybe the simple story is the true story. Maybe civilization really did start 10,000 years ago, and everything before that was just small groups of humans surviving and not building anything permanent or complex. I don't know which version is true. And that uncertainty, that not knowing, is important to sit with. Because it reflects the actual state of our knowledge. We don't know everything about our past. We can't know everything. There are limits to what archaeology can tell us, limits to what the evidence can show. And those limits mean there's room for mystery. Room for questions that don't have definitive answers. Room for multiple possibilities that we have to hold simultaneously without collapsing into certainty. And maybe that's uncomfortable. Humans like certainty. We like clear narratives with beginnings and middles and ends. We like to know where we came from and where we're going. But the truth is messier than that. The truth is that we're making our best guesses based on incomplete information, and those guesses might be wrong, and we have to be okay with that. We have to be okay with uncertainty and ambiguity, and the possibility that the ground we're standing on is not as firm as we'd like it to be. Because if we can't tolerate uncertainty about the past, how can we possibly navigate uncertainty about the future? And the future is uncertain. Deeply, profoundly uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen next year, let alone next century or next millennium. We don't know if our civilization will continue to grow and spread throughout the solar system and beyond, or if it will collapse and fragment and reset. We don't know if we'll solve the problems we're currently facing, the climate crisis and the technological risks and the social tensions, or if those problems will overwhelm us. We don't know if we're living in the early chapters of a story that continues for millions of years, or in the final chapters of a story that's about to end. All we can do is observe the patterns. Look at how civilizations have behaved in the past, both recent past and deep past. Look at how complex systems respond to stress. Look at the warning signs and the tipping points and the feedback loops. And then make choices based on that observation, knowing that our choices might not matter, that forces beyond our control might determine the outcome, but also knowing that our choices are the only thing we can actually influence. And one of the most important choices we can make is to preserve knowledge. Not just scientific and technical knowledge, though that's important, but also wisdom. The hard-won understanding of how to live together, how to organize societies, how to balance individual freedom with collective well-being, how to think long-term instead of just reacting to immediate pressures. This kind of knowledge is harder to preserve because it's not easily written down. It's embedded in cultures and traditions and institutions that take generations to develop, and can be destroyed in a single generation if the transmission is interrupted. Think about democracy. It's a concept that's thousands of years old. The ancient Greeks practiced it in some form. The Roman Republic had elements of it. Various societies throughout history have experimented with giving citizens a voice in governance. But the specific form of democracy that most modern nations practice had to be rediscovered and reinvented and adapted over centuries of trial and error. And it's fragile. It requires constant maintenance. It requires citizens who understand its principles and value them enough to defend them. And when those conditions aren't met, democracies can collapse back into authoritarianism or oligarchy or chaos. And the knowledge of how to make democracy work, the practical wisdom that accumulates through experience, that knowledge can be lost. We've seen it happen in small-scale examples. Countries that transition from democracy to dictatorship and then, generations later, try to transition back. And they struggle because the institutional knowledge is gone. The people who remember how democratic institutions functioned are gone. The habits and norms and unwritten rules that made those institutions work are gone. They have to rebuild from scratch, and it's difficult and sometimes it fails. Now imagine that on a civilizational scale. After a reset, after a collapse so complete that not just specific governments fall but the entire global system of organization falls. The knowledge of how to run a democratic society would be lost along with everything else. Future humans would have to rediscover it. They'd have to go through all the same experiments and failures and gradually, over centuries, build back up to something resembling what we have now. And maybe they'd do it better. Maybe they'd avoid some of the mistakes we made. Or maybe they'd make different mistakes. Worse mistakes. There's no guarantee that civilizations get better with each iteration. Progress is not inevitable. But there is a kind of ratchet effect in the development of knowledge. Once an idea is discovered, once a technology is invented, once a principle is understood, it becomes easier to rediscover it. Not guaranteed, but easier, because the possibility has been demonstrated. The path has been shown. Even if the specific details are lost, the knowledge that something is possible makes it more likely that someone will try to do it again. This is why we see certain inventions emerging independently in multiple cultures. Agriculture was invented at least 7 separate times in different parts of the world. Writing was invented independently at least 4 times. Cities, metallurgy, mathematics, astronomy, all of these things emerged in multiple places at multiple times without direct contact between the cultures. Because once the conditions are right, once a society reaches a certain level of complexity and stability, these developments become almost inevitable. So maybe resets aren't as catastrophic as they sound. Maybe they just delay things, set us back a few thousand years. But the trajectory remains the same. The potential remains the same. Consciousness keeps emerging. Civilization keeps developing. Knowledge keeps accumulating. Just with interruptions, with setbacks, with periods of darkness between the periods of light. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's even necessary. Maybe civilizations need to fail in order to learn. Maybe the only way to truly understand the fragility of complex systems is to watch them collapse and then have to rebuild them. Maybe each reset teaches lessons that can't be learned any other way. And those lessons get encoded into the collective unconscious, into the deep patterns of human behavior and culture, in ways that persist even when the specific memories are lost. Carl Jung talked about the collective unconscious, about archetypes that appear across cultures independent of direct transmission. The hero's journey, the wise old man, the great mother, the shadow, the trickster. These figures appear in myths and stories from all over the world, in cultures that had no contact with each other, which suggests that they're tapping into something deeper than cultural transmission, something built into the structure of human psychology. Jung thought these archetypes were inherited, passed down through evolution, reflecting experiences that were so fundamental to human existence that they became baked into our cognitive architecture. What if some of those archetypes are memories of resets? The flood myth archetype, the fall from paradise archetype, the return of the golden age archetype. What if these aren't just random stories we tell ourselves but echoes of real events that were so traumatic, so significant, that they imprinted themselves on our collective psyche in a way that transcends individual memory? This is speculative, deeply speculative. But it's worth considering because it offers a mechanism for how information could persist across resets, even when all physical evidence is destroyed. The information doesn't survive in books or buildings or artifacts. It survives in us, in the patterns of our thinking, in the stories we tell, in the symbols and images that resonate with us on a level we don't consciously understand. And if that's true, if we're carrying the memory of previous civilizations within us in some form, then paying attention to those memories, to those myths and symbols and stories becomes important. Not because they're literal historical records, but because they're pointing toward truths that we've forgotten on a conscious level but still know on a deeper level. They're like dreams, full of symbolism and distortion, but also full of meaning if you know how to interpret them. Joseph Campbell spent his career studying mythology and finding the common patterns that run through all human stories. He called it the monomyth, the hero's journey, the story of someone who leaves the ordinary world, goes through trials and tribulations, acquires some kind of knowledge or power, and then returns to share it with their community. And this story appears everywhere. In ancient myths, in modern movies, in religious texts, in personal narratives. It's the story of transformation, of death and rebirth, of descent into darkness and return to light. And maybe it's also the story of civilization. We start in the ordinary world, in the simple sustainable state of hunter-gatherer existence. We leave that world through the development of agriculture and cities and technology. We go through trials, through wars and plagues and environmental crises. We acquire knowledge, sometimes at great cost. And then, what? Do we return to share that knowledge with a renewed community? Do we achieve some kind of synthesis where we keep the benefits of civilization while avoiding the pitfalls? Or do we fail the journey, succumb to the trials, and have to start over? We're in the middle of the story right now. We can't see the ending yet. We don't know which version we're living through. The triumphant return or the tragic failure or something in between. All we can do is keep moving forward, keep making choices, keep trying to learn from our mistakes and not repeat them. But the fact that this story exists, the fact that it's so deeply embedded in human consciousness, suggests that we've been through this before. That the journey of civilization from simplicity to complexity and the challenges that come with that journey, this is not new. This is a pattern. And patterns repeat. Think about your own life. Think about the cycles you've gone through. periods of growth and periods of stagnation. Times when everything seemed to be coming together and times when everything fell apart. And if you're paying attention, if you're learning from the experience, you start to recognize the patterns. You start to see the warning signs. You start to notice when you're heading toward a collapse and can maybe course correct before it happens. Or if the collapse happens anyway, you know how to rebuild. You know that the darkness is temporary, that the cycle will turn, that growth will come again. Civilizations work the same way. They go through cycles of expansion and contraction, of centralization and fragmentation, of integration and disintegration. And if we're paying attention to the pattern, if we're studying history and mythology and archaeology and all the traces of previous cycles, we can start to recognize where we are in the pattern. We can start to see the warning signs. And maybe, just maybe, we can intervene. We can make different choices. We can break the pattern or at least modify it. Extend the period of flourishing. Soften the impact of the collapse. Preserve more knowledge through the transition. This is what it means to learn from history. Not just to memorize dates and names and events, but to understand the patterns. To see the recurring dynamics that play out across different times and places and scales. To recognize that we're not as unique as we think we are. That the problems we're facing, the choices we're making, the trajectory we're on, all of this has precedent. Maybe not exact precedent because every situation is unique in its details, but precedent in the pattern, in the deep structure. And the deep structure of civilization seems to be cyclic. Growth, complexity, fragility, crisis, collapse, reset. And then, if conditions permit, growth again. A new cycle beginning from the ruins of the old. How many times has this happened? We don't know. We can't know. The evidence gets erased with each iteration. But the pattern persists. The possibility persists. And as long as there are humans or whatever we evolve into, or whatever species emerges after us if we go extinct, as long as there is consciousness and curiosity and the drive to build and create and understand, the pattern will continue. Because that's what consciousness does in a material universe. It organizes matter into increasingly complex forms. It creates structure and meaning and beauty out of chaos. And sometimes those structures collapse back into chaos. And then they get built again. And the universe continues its experiment, testing different configurations, different possibilities, different paths through the space of what's possible. We are that experiment. You and me and everyone who has ever lived and everyone who will ever live. We're all part of the same process, the same pattern, the same cycle of creation and destruction and recreation that has been running since the first self-replicating molecules formed in some primordial ocean billions of years ago. And knowing that, really internalizing that, changes how you see everything. Your own life becomes simultaneously more precious and less significant. More precious because you're part of something vast and ancient and ongoing. Less significant because you're just one small iteration in an infinite series. One note in an endless song. One wave in an eternal ocean. And both of those perspectives are true. Both of them are important to hold. You matter and you don't matter. Your choices have consequences and they're ultimately meaningless. The civilization you're part of could last forever or could end tomorrow. And either way, the pattern continues. This is the strange wisdom that comes from contemplating resets. Not optimism or pessimism, but something deeper. Acceptance, maybe. Or equanimity. The ability to hold contradictions without needing to resolve them. To appreciate the moment without clinging to it. To work toward the future without being attached to outcomes. Because in the end, whether or not civilization has been reset before, whether or not it will be reset again, the response is the same. Live fully. Create beauty. Seek truth. Love deeply. Preserve what's valuable. Let go of what's not. Be present to the mystery and the uncertainty and the vast, incomprehensible strangeness of being a conscious being in an unconscious universe. That's all we can do. That's all we've ever been able to do. And it's enough. Has to be enough. 'Cause it's all there is. The day human civilization was reset, if it happened, was just another day in the life of the universe. Transition point. A discontinuity in one small planet story. Significant to us, but barely a flicker in the cosmic scale. And yet, within that flicker, within that brief moment of consciousness and civilization and all the drama and achievement and suffering and joy that comes with it, there is infinite depth, infinite meaning, infinite value, not because it lasts, but because it happens at all. And that's the final truth I want to leave you with. Not certainty about whether resets have occurred or will occur. Not answers to the questions we've been exploring. But the simple, profound recognition that existence itself is extraordinary. That consciousness is a miracle. That the fact that you are here, reading these words, thinking these thoughts, experiencing this moment, is more improbable and more precious than any story we could tell about lost civilizations or cosmic cycles or the future of humanity. You are the universe experiencing itself. And whether this moment is part of the first iteration of human civilization or the 100th, whether it lasts another 10,000 years or ends tomorrow, right now you exist. You are aware. You are part of the pattern. And the pattern is beautiful. Even in its chaos, even in its cycles of creation and destruction, even in its fundamental uncertainty and impermanence, especially in its impermanence, because that's what makes it real.